Yep.
the rebels. And then he sent soldiers to destroy everything left behind so the rebels would have nothing to benefit from. No animals to eat, no homes to stay in, no crops. So not only is this bad for the rebels, who needed local support, but the families, they lost their homes and their livelihoods, and they often died of hunger and disease because all the resources had been destroyed. This stuff just makes me sick because I feel like the vulnerable, women, children, men who just want to mind their own business and farm for their families, they end up getting hurt the worst. Anyway, I digress. Jose Marti died in battle within the first 3 months, and to add insult to injury, the Spanish then said, "When we kill Maceo, we will make a broom with his beard." Boy. The rebels fought hard, but sadly, General Maceo died in battle, and everyone mourned, even New York mourned. But they did not make a broom out of his beard. Thank goodness, that's ghastly. But now the movement had lost Marti and Maceo, yet Spain still wasn't winning. And in the late 1890s, 1897, Spain removed the Cuban governor and promised Cuba that it was going to be able to elect its own government, have control over its own domestic affairs. Spain would still rule them, but we'll give you some concessions.
Oh, I did.
The rebels were like, nope, we're doing this all the way. It's peace. We're not having peace without independence. We've done that twice. It's independence or bust. Some Cubans actually approached the U.S. and they're like, hey, maybe a deal can be struck here. But that's not what Marti had wanted. He specifically wrote the day before his death that there should be no master of Cuba, quote, either Yankee or Spaniard, end of quote. U.S. leaders were nervous about a victory for Cuba. They'd been okay with Cuba being ruled by a weak Spain, but when Spain was starting to lose, it was making the U.S. nervous. So they sent a U.S. battleship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor to protect U.S. citizens and interests. Then one day, the USS Maine just exploded. To this day, no one knows what caused it. Spain and Cuba believed the U.S. had done it to themselves to get a foot into Cuba. The U.S. said, no way, this is Spain. And the American public wanted war. After 2 months, Congress declared war on Spain. This is April 1898. And the U.S. promised it wasn't going after Cuba. They basically said, we will leave Cuba once the Cubans can govern themselves and things are peaceful. We're doing this to get back in Spain. Some historians think that the U.S. joined the war to unite the North and South, since it was having its own issues after the Civil War and needed something to bring it together. Some say it was because it did want control over Cuba and it wasn't going to admit it. Others say the U.S. just really wanted to overthrow a European colony in the Americas. Even Teddy Roosevelt wrote he was, quote, a quietly rampant Cuba Libre man, end of quote. And he felt like it was America's duty to intervene in Cuba and to, quote, take this opportunity of driving the Spaniards from the Western world, end of quote. They ended up calling it the Spanish-American War, even though, from my point of view, it really was just a continuation of the War of Independence the Cuban rebels were fighting against the Spanish. The U.S. had just added their support, but they rebranded it as the Spanish-American War. It took only 4 months for Spain to give up. It was a great day for Cuba. It was finally free of Spanish rule. However, we know that after a war, it takes time to figure out what things are going to look like. And the U.S. had said, we've got no intention of annexing or controlling Cuba long term. There's something called the Teller Amendment, basically stated, once peace has been restored to Cuba, the Cuban people will govern it. However, here's where it gets a little sketchy. In the days after the fighting had ended, there was so much uncertainty that there became a bit of a power vacuum, and it seems as though the U.S. stepped into it. The American generals suddenly wouldn't let Cuban forces into some cities, and American leaders kept Cuban representatives out of some of the most key negotiations with the Spanish. Cubans quickly began to feel like the U.S. didn't see them as capable to govern themselves and began to worry that the U.S. was not going to partner with them, that they were going to dominate them. And in the end, not a single Cuban representative was present when Spain and the U.S. signed the Treaty of Paris, which what resulted from that was that Spain relinquished control over Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. This is December 1898. I'll be honest, my personal opinion, looking at this from our modern perspective, this is not a good look. It's not a good look for the U.S. And on January 1st, 1899, Spanish flags came down across Cuba, but instead of a Cuban flag being raised, the U.S. flag was raised. And Cuban military leaders and veterans watched in frustration and uncertainty, like what's going to happen to Cuba? It's not Spanish anymore. They've taken all of their soldiers and they're gone. But now Cuba is more or less occupied by the U.S. military under the terms of pacification. And U.S. authorities took control of many aspects of the government. They began appointing mayors, disbanding the army, replacing it with something else called the Rural Guard, which favored more elites. Now, you'll remember, the U.S. was under Jim Crow laws at this time, and so a multiracial army like the Liberation Army was not very comfortable for them. People within the U.S. and Cuba began to push for Cuba to have full independence right away. There were rallies and articles, and the U.S. governor of Cuba said troops wouldn't leave until Cuba could prove that they could self-govern, which was kind of ambiguous. This was a different time. It wasn't like they laid out a binder of exactly what has to be done to get the U.S. to leave. The U.S. began to shape Cuban laws, social programs like education. They opened hundreds of schools. Students began to learn U.S. history. U.S. citizens in Cuba were treated differently, better, and were able to invest more easily than Cubans. For example, there were some policies that allowed U.S. investors to buy up land that left many small Cuban landowners out of good options. This benefited the U.S., but it really didn't help people who were rebuilding their lives after a tragic war. And in 1901, the U.S. made the Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S. more influence over Cuba, rights to maintain a naval base in Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is in the southeast of Cuba. It's a very strategic place for monitoring the Caribbean from a military perspective. And there were protests over the Platt Amendment. Many people in the U.S. and Cuba wanted the U.S. out. So finally, in May of 1902, the U.S. governor handed over power to Cuba's new president, Tomas Estrada Palma, and Cuba became a democratic republic. However, the Platt Amendment remained in force, and the U.S. was more or less allowed to intervene in Cuba's foreign relations, finances, other things. So many did not feel like Cuba had full sovereignty. And this is important because it sets the stage for further unrest in Cuba for the next 60 years, which we're covering in parts 2 and 3. So we're going to stop there. We have covered so much. Cuba's been through a lot in the 400 years that we've covered. So let's review. Cuba is the largest Caribbean island. It's in a strategic location. Indigenous peoples lived there for many years before 1492, when Columbus claims it for Spain and initiates Spanish settlement, as well as devastation of the native population. As the native population declines, African slaves are brought in to work in agriculture and mining. The money begins to flow. Havana becomes a key port for the Spanish. It grows into a major city. Cuba even helps out in the American Revolution. In the late 1700s, Cuba's sugar industry boomed and relied heavily on African slaves under brutal conditions. Despite British bans on the slave trade, an illegal market thrived. And as the U.S. expanded, it had its eye on Cuba, and they became close trade partners. Inspired by Haiti's revolution, Cuban abolitionists and slaves staged many rebellions. They were brutally repressed. When slavery was outlawed in the U.S., Cuba became ripe for its own war, and the First War of Independence lasted for 10 years. Eventually, slavery was abolished. Still, Cuba was Spanish. Rebel leaders began to emphasize racial unity more and more as the fight for independence continued. From 1895 to 1898, rebels fought against the Spanish. This includes Jose Marti, Generals Gomez and Paseo, and the U.S. jumped in for the last 4 months. The U.S. calls this the Spanish-American War. Cubans call it the Cuban War of Independence, their third one to be exact. It's a little mini war in between the first and third. The U.S. steps in after the war, and they govern. And under the premise of pacification to help Cuba get ready to govern itself, they also secured many American financial prospects in the process. This frustrated many Cubans who wanted full sovereignty, full independence. In 1902, Cuba became a republic with a Cuban president, but the U.S. still had powerful sway in what would happen due to the Platt Amendment. Oh, in 400 years, Cuba has changed a lot. Look at where it started to look at where it is in 1902. And in parts 2 and 3, we're going to take it from 1902 until 2025. So that's a lot. We've got Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs, revolutions, Fidel Castro. There's a lot that's going to come in parts 2 and 3, and we've just built the foundation here. We're building momentum here with part 1 to help explain why some of those things happened, right? Because the past history informs our current events. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to give a takeaway yet because I have takeaways for parts 2 and 3. This kind of a foundation. So I really enjoyed making this episode. Thank you so much for listening, for sharing the podcast, for supporting on Patreon. That's patreon.com/wiserworldpodcast if you want more images, maps, additional resources to help you learn. And thank you so much again for learning with me. And I hope that until part 2 comes out in a couple of weeks, that we can all go out and make the world a little wiser. What role did the Platt Amendment play? What role did race play in Cuban society during the early 1900s? Who was Gerardo Machado, and how did he become Cuba's first dictator? How did Cuban citizens fight back? How was the mafia involved in Cuba? Who was Fulgencio Bautista, and how did he influence Cuban politics? Who is Fidel Castro, and how did he and his fellow rebels launch a revolution that would change Cuba forever? We'll answer these questions and many more in today's episode, Cuba 101, Part 2 of 3. Welcome to Wiser World, a podcast for busy people who need a refresher on all things world. Here we explore different regions of the globe, giving you the facts and context you need to think historically about current events. I truly believe that the more we learn about the world, the more we embrace our shared humanity. I'm your host, Ali Roper. Thanks for being here.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Hello. I am back with part 2 of 3 on Cuba today, and it probably goes without saying, but if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, please just press pause now. Go back and do that. Things will not make as much sense without it. That episode lays all the groundwork for this episode in part 3, and as we know, context is critical with history. So, before we get into it, just a reminder that I designed these episodes for people who know very little to nothing about Cuba, so you can walk away with a good, basic foundational history. But it's not completely comprehensive. Due to time, I do leave things out. So as always, please do independent research from other sources because this history is complex and sometimes contested. If you need help to begin finding some good options, I will be sharing many through my Patreon, which you can sign up for at patreon.com/wiserworldpodcast. I share a lot of pictures, maps, videos, articles, books that you can use to learn more about Cuba. And also just a quick content warning for this episode, I do talk briefly in a non-graphic way about prostitution in this episode. In case you have little ears around, maybe not for them. And I will be sharing my takeaways along the way this time, a little bit at the end too, but we're gonna try something a little different this time because I have thoughts. All right, we ended part 1 in 1902. You'll remember from part 1 that Cuba gained its independence from Spain in 1898, but it was still under U.S. control. Cuba had a U.S. governor with full administrative and military control until 1902. Fun fact, the governor was a really good friend of Teddy Roosevelt. During this time, the U.S. shaped much of Cuba, opening thousands of schools, giving teacher training, encouraging Cubans to take self-governance slowly, and more importantly, they influenced the economy, especially with agriculture, where U.S. investors were able to buy up land much more easily than smaller Cuban farmers. So Cuba did not have the full sovereignty that it really wanted. The U.S. had also introduced the Platt Amendment, which had conditions for Cuba should it become independent. So for example, if Cuba were to become independent,